My sister-in-law handed me a fake will 3 days after my dad's funeral and told me I had 30 days to get out of the only home I've ever known. But what she didn't know was that my father left me something she could never forge. Would you fight your own family in court to defend what's rightfully yours? If stories like this keep you hooked, don't forget to hit follow for more real-life drama. They say grief brings people together, that it softens old grudges, reminds you what matters. Whoever said that never met my sister-in-law. 3 days after we buried my father, Vanessa invited me to brunch like nothing had happened. We sat at a sunny little cafe just off Main Street in Asheville. I was still wearing black, my hands still smelled faintly like funeral lilies, and she had a manila envelope and a mimosa. She smiled over her glass, glossy lips, fake sympathy. "Rachel," she said, like we were girlfriends catching up, "I wanted to talk to you before the realtor comes by." My stomach flipped. "What realtor?" She slid the envelope across the table with 2 manicured fingers. "Dan and I are putting the house on the market. We're thinking of moving closer to his new job in Charlotte." I stared at her, blinked. "The house isn't yours to sell." She cocked her head. "It is, actually. Dan's name is on the deed now. Your dad left the house to him. It's all in the will. You can read it." I didn't touch the envelope. She leaned in, lowering her voice like she was giving me a gift. "We're giving you 30 days. That's more than fair." My heart pounded, but I kept my face still. That house was mine. I lived there with him. I took care of him. The Venice's smile didn't budge. "And Dan is his son, the only son." She said it like it was a fact, like biology overruled sacrifice. I didn't yell, didn't cry. I nodded slowly, stood up and walked out. But inside, something cracked, and something else started to burn. My name is Rachel Miller. I'm 29, single, and until 3 days ago I lived with my father in the same creaky old house I grew up in. When he got diagnosed with Parkinson's, I left my job in Atlanta to move back and take care of him full-time. We weren't rich, there was no fancy inheritance waiting. Just that house, our home. The porch with the rocking chairs, the magnolia tree he planted when I was 5. Dan, my older brother, had moved out the moment he graduated, visited on Christmas, sent texts on birthdays, but never offered to help. Vanessa? She barely spoke to Dad, but suddenly she was his heir apparent. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in his study, still smelling like Old Spice and dust, and let the anger roll through me. I thought about the envelope. The smugness in Vanessa's voice, the way Dan hadn't even called me since the funeral. Had they planned this before Dad even passed? At some point, I got up and started sorting through his old desk drawers, not looking for anything, just needing to feel him close. That's when I found it. Tucked beneath a stack of insurance papers and medical receipts was a small navy blue envelope. My name was on the front in his handwriting. Inside, a folded piece of notebook paper and a sealed legal envelope. I opened the note first. "Rachel," it said. "If you're reading this, then something's gone wrong. I want you to know I saw you. Every night you stayed up with me, every doctor's appointment, every bath you helped me take. I'm sorry I didn't say it enough, but I'm proud of you. You're not just my daughter. You're the reason I was able to die at home, in peace. That house is yours. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." My hands shook as I opened the legal envelope. There it was, a notarized will, dated 6 months ago, clear as daylight. I, Thomas Miller, leave my full estate, including the property at 14 Maple Ridge Drive, to my daughter, Rachel Miller, in recognition of her full-time care and dedication during my final years. I sat there for a long time, the letter pressed to my chest. Vanessa had brought a copy, but I held the original. And my father's words. This wasn't just about a house anymore. This was about respect, about truth, about fighting for the one person who had always believed in me. And suddenly, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I just sat there in the study with that will in my lap, and my dad's note folded between my fingers like a lifeline. Every time I thought I'd calm down, another wave of anger came crashing back. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the arrogance, the entitlement. Vanessa waltzing in with a mimosa and a manila envelope like she was doing me a favor by giving me 30 days to get out, like I was a squatter in my own damn house. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't just going to let this go. Dad had trusted me to fight for what he left behind. That meant something. And if Dan and Vanessa wanted to turn this into a battle, then so be it. I dug deeper into Dad's files, just to be sure. Everything was there. His signature, the lawyer's notary stamp, dates, medical records proving he was of sound mind when he signed it. He'd covered every base, as if he knew someone might try to twist things after he was gone. That thought broke my heart a little, knowing he'd felt the need to protect me even after death. Later that day, I called the law office listed on the documents. The receptionist put me through to a man named James Pollard, Dad's old attorney. His voice cracked a little when I introduced myself. "Rachel," he said, "your dad was one of the good ones. I still remember him showing up here with a sandwich for me every time he came in, said I worked too hard to skip lunch. I told him about Vanessa, about the fake will, about everything. He didn't sound surprised, just disappointed. Bring everything in," he said. "I'll take a look, make some calls, we'll sort this out." Before I left the house, I stopped by Dad's room. It still smelled like him, like aftershave and wood polish and peppermint tea. I sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, letting the quiet fill my lungs. Then, on instinct, I opened the wooden chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were blankets, photo albums, an old army jacket and a quilt box I hadn't seen before. One of those hand-painted ones with the... I opened it. There, beneath a stack of faded photographs, was another note, folded into quarters and yellowing at the edges. This one wasn't addressed to anyone, just written in Dad's neat, blocky handwriting. "They won't understand," it said. "They'll call it unfair, selfish even, but you don't measure love by who shows up for holidays. You measure it by who stays when things get ugly. Rachel stayed. She saw me when I couldn't see myself, and if giving her the house makes me a bad father, then so be it. I'd do it 100 times over." I didn't cry. Not then. I just pressed the letter to my chest and closed my eyes. Because now I had more than a will. I had his words, his truth. In a world where everyone seemed ready to forget who I was and what I'd done, Dad had left behind something louder than any forged document. When I got to the law office, Mr. Pollard met me in person. He wore a tweed blazer that smelled like old paper and kindness. He looked through the documents carefully, then nodded. "This is solid," he said. "Ironclad. I notarized this myself. I remember your dad insisted on it. He didn't trust your brother's wife. Said she had eyes like a crow at a funeral." His words, not mine. That made me laugh. Just a little. The first real laugh I'd had in weeks. Pollard straightened the papers into a folder. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we're filing a cease and desist, no selling, no eviction threats. Then, if they push back, we file for probate. You've got the original will. They've got, well, lies. And I don't like losing." I left his office feeling like the ground beneath my feet had finally steadied. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had a plan. I had proof. I had Dad's voice backing me up, in ink and in heart. But deep down I knew this wouldn't be over easily. Vanessa didn't strike me as the type to back down without a scene. And Dan, well, he hadn't even called me since the funeral. That silence spoke louder than any lawyer. So I went home, made myself a strong cup of coffee, sat on the porch Dad built with his bare hands, and watched the sun dip below the tree line. I didn't know what the next few weeks would bring, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't leaving. Not quietly, not at all. 3 days later, Vanessa showed up at the house unannounced. I heard her heels on the porch before I even looked up. She didn't knock, just opened the screen door like she still had a key to everything. "I want to see the will," she said, skipping over hello. "The one you're claiming is real." I stayed seated at the kitchen table, sipping cold coffee and reading through notes James Pollard had helped me organize. I didn't look up. "It's already with a lawyer," she scoffed. James Pollard, that old man still kicking around? I finally raised my eyes. He remembers notarizing it, so yes, still kicking. She paced the kitchen like she owned it, fingers tapping against her purse strap. "Look, Rachel, I get that you're grieving, but Dan and I have a baby on the way, this house. It's the most practical choice. We can't afford to buy in Charlotte right now, and this is just sitting here rotting with old memories." I stared at her. Those old memories are my father. This was his home, and he left it to me. She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering into a hiss. "You really want to go to court over this? Drag Dan's name through the mud? Split the family?" My blood went cold. "You already did that. The second you walked into that brunch with a forged will." She didn't deny it, just gave me this icy little smirk and turned on her heel like the matter was settled. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't try." I didn't hear from Dan until the next week, when I got a text at 11:42 p.m. It said, "Hey, can we talk?" We met at a diner we used to go to as kids. He looked older than I remembered, more tired, like fatherhood was already weighing on him even before the baby arrived. He didn't order anything, just stared at the table. "I didn't want it to go this way," he said. "You signed off on it?" I replied. He sighed. "Vanessa said Dad changed his will without telling anyone, that it was probably confused, thinking with the Parkinson's and all. She just didn't want to fight." I leaned forward. "Then why bring one?" He didn't answer. I pushed the papers toward him. The original will, the notarized signature, the letter Dad left in the quilt box. He looked at them, face unreadable. "Rachel, she's pregnant. We're drowning in medical bills. She thought, if we sold this place, maybe it'd finally give us some breathing room." I laughed. I couldn't help it, a sharp, bitter sound that felt foreign in my own throat. "So, you sell off my life, my memories, my home, because you two don't want to struggle?" He flinched, but didn't deny it. I stood up. "You could have just asked for help, but instead, you let her come at me like a thief in high heels." He reached out, trying to touch my hand. "Rach, I swear, I didn't know she faked anything." I stared at him, quiet for a beat. Then I said, "You knew. Maybe not the details, but you knew it didn't feel right, and you let it happen anyway." That night, I sent everything to James. We filed the cease and desist against any sale or transfer of the house. Dan and Vanessa were served the next day. 2 weeks later, they hit back. A formal response arrived by mail. Dan and Vanessa were disputing the will, claiming Dad was not of sound mind when he signed it, and that I had coerced him during his final months. In their version, I had isolated him, manipulated him, and cut off contact with the rest of the family. I read every line of their accusation with shaking hands. Then I opened my laptop and pulled out the calendar. Every doctor's appointment, every in-home nurse visit, every meal delivery log, documented and time-stamped. Dad hadn't been alone. He'd had an entire network of people around him, and every single one of them knew the truth. James called that evening. "It's a Hail Mary," he said. "They've got nothing but narrative, but it still means court, depositions, witnesses." "I'm ready," I said. A week later, I found myself walking into a courthouse for the first time in my life, heels clicking on polished floors, my father's letter folded in my purse like a charm. Vanessa wore all black, like she was mourning again. Dan looked like he hadn't slept. They sat across from me at the mediation table, smug and confident. Their lawyer looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate commercial, slick, cold, bored. He opened with, "My clients are willing to settle for a 50/50 split." I leaned back in my chair and said, "My father wasn't." Silence stretched across the room, like glass about to shatter. Their lawyer shifted. "Ms. Miller, this can get ugly. You really want to drag your family through depositions and subpoenas?" I pulled out a USB stick and placed it on the table. On that drive is video from Dad's in-home nurse, taken a week before he signed the will. He talks clearly, laughs, says he's leaving everything to me. The lawyer looked at me, then at Vanessa. She didn't meet his eye. Dan was pale. James smiled faintly beside me and said, "That offer to settle, it's off the table now." I didn't walk out of that room victorious. Not yet. But I walked out unshaken. They wanted a fight. Now they had one. And I had more than proof. I had the truth. The voicemail came the next morning. I was sipping coffee at the kitchen table, rereading my lawyer's notes, when I saw the missed call from a Florida number. Mum. I hadn't heard from her since the funeral. Just a few stiff texts about flower arrangements and burial plots. I played the message. "Rachel, I just heard from Daniel. He says you're taking this to court. Really? Is this what your father would have wanted?" "I'm flying up. We need to talk." She arrived the next day, suitcase in one hand, disapproval in the other. She didn't ask how I was, didn't hug me, just walked into the house, looked around like it belonged to someone she used to know, and sat down on the couch with a sigh. "I can't believe you're doing this," she said. "You're tearing this family apart." I stood in the doorway of the living room, arms crossed. "I'm protecting what Dad gave me." She shook her head. "You're being selfish." That word hit harder than it should have. Me. Selfish. After years of bathing my father, lifting him from his wheelchair, spoon-feeding him applesauce when his hands stopped working, after holding his hand when he cried because his body betrayed him, after sleeping on the couch outside his room so he wouldn't feel alone at night. "Selfish?" I repeated, my voice quiet. "You didn't even come visit when he stopped walking. You called once a week, sent birthday cards, but I was the one wiping drool off his chin." She looked away. I couldn't handle seeing him like that. "Well, I didn't have that choice." She stood abruptly, walking toward the window. "Dan has a child on the way. He has a family. What do you have, Rachel? This house? A ghost?" I flinched. She didn't say it with cruelty. She said it like she was disappointed in me for not having a ring on my finger and 2 kids in a minivan by 30, like caretaking wasn't enough to justify a roof over my head. "Dad made a choice," I said. "He knew exactly what he was doing." She turned, face stern. "He was dying. You don't know what kind of pressure you put on him." I stared at her in disbelief. "You think I guilted him into this? You were always good at making people feel bad for you." The words were knives, dull but heavy. All I could think about was the day I'd come home from college after Dad's diagnosis. How I'd told my mum I was moving back. How she'd said, "That's sweet, honey, but don't let it ruin your life." It hadn't ruined my life. It had revealed it. "I'm not going to stop the case," I said. "No matter what you say." She stepped forward. "If you go through with this, don't expect me to be in your life after. I can't support this kind of division." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I'd already lost her. Maybe I never had her to begin with. Maybe I was just the daughter who stayed quiet, cleaned up after everyone, and never asked for anything in return. "You chose your side," I said. "So did Dad. I'm just the only one listening to him." She didn't say goodbye when she left, just rolled her suitcase across the floor, paused in the doorway and muttered, "Your father would be ashamed of this mess." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. That night I sat in the backyard with a glass of wine and the stars above me. The magnolia tree was starting to bloom again. Dad used to say it was late every year, like it didn't want to show up for spring. But when it did, it came in strong, Bold, fragrant, impossible to ignore. I thought about how families could rot from the inside, even when the outside looked perfectly trimmed. How people like Vanessa could manipulate others, how even Dan could be swayed by fear and ego, and how my own mother, my own blood, could look at me and see someone unworthy of a home. Still, I didn't feel defeated. I felt strangely calm, because I knew the truth. And soon, so would everyone else. The courthouse smelled like lemon polish and anxiety. Everything was too bright, floors too clean, lights too harsh. I sat in the hallway outside the hearing room, knees bouncing, fists clenched in my lap. James Pollard sat beside me, flipping through a yellow legal pad with the same calm he had when discussing lunch options. "They'll try to rattle you," he said. "Let them. Stay composed. You've got the truth. They've got theatrics." When my name was called, I walked in with my shoulders square and my father's letter tucked in my purse. Dan and Vanessa were already at the other table. Dan looked hollow. Vanessa wore a sharp black blazer and blood-red lipstick, like she was auditioning for a legal drama. Her attorney, some sleek, silver-haired man named Burke, stood as the judge entered and began listing the case. Inheritance dispute, will contest, claims of undue influence. I thought of the years I spent in that house, wiping my dad's mouth, setting reminders for his pills, whispering to him when the tremors got so bad he couldn't hold a spoon. Now here I was, being accused of manipulation, coercion, fraud. Burke opened with a charming smile and a condescending tone. "Your Honour, my client simply wish for a fair and rightful distribution of Mr. Miller's estate. Unfortunately, Miss Miller, Rachel, took advantage of her father's deteriorating mental state in his final year. She isolated him, convinced him to alter his will, and now seeks to deny the rightful heir, his only son, access to the family property." The word isolated made my stomach turn. I stared straight ahead, breathing slowly. James rose next. "Your Honour, we will show that Mr. Thomas Miller updated his will of his own volition while mentally competent, and did so out of deep appreciation for the daughter who cared for him daily, emotionally, physically, and financially. We will further demonstrate the opposing party's knowledge of this update and their deliberate effort to suppress it." What followed felt like a slow, brutal unravelling. Vanessa took the stand first. She spoke confidently, like a woman with nothing to hide. She said I had distanced Dad from the rest of the family, refused to let Dan visit, controlled his mail, his medications, his finances. She said I often cried in front of him to make him feel guilty. She guilt-tripped him constantly, Vanessa said. She knew exactly what she was doing. I clenched my jaw as James stood for cross-examination. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "did you know that Thomas's nurse visited him 3 times a week?" She blinked. "I was told someone came." James nodded. "Did you know those visits were documented and that the nurse testified Mr. Miller was always alert and clear-headed during their sessions?" Vanessa didn't answer. "Did you know that your husband, Mr. Daniel Miller, sent less than 5 text messages to his father in the entire year of 2022? Den looked down at the table. "And are you aware," James continued, "that your client attempted to sell the property in question just 1 week after the funeral, before any legal review of the will was conducted?" "Objection," Burke called out, but the judge allowed it. Vanessa's cheeks turned blotchy. "We were just preparing." "For a home you didn't legally own," James said evenly. "Got it." Next, I took the stand. I told the court everything. How I'd left Atlanta to care for Dad, how I cleaned his feeding tubes, argued with insurance, spoon-fed him mashed potatoes, how I'd given up job opportunities, dating, vacations, everything, to make sure he didn't die alone. Then James asked me to read the letter. I didn't want to cry in court, but when I unfolded that creased piece of paper and read aloud the words my father left me, words about seeing me, about being proud of me, I couldn't help it. My voice shook, a tear slid down my cheek, but I kept reading. When I finished, The courtroom was silent. Then came the final nail. James queued up a video on the projector, footage from Dad's nurse, just a week before the will was signed. In it, Dad smiled weakly at the camera, joked about my terrible coffee, and said clearly, "Rachel's the only reason I'm still smiling. I want her to have the house. She's earned it 10 times over." The judge watched closely. Vanessa wouldn't meet his eye. Dan buried his face in his hands. When all was said and done, the judge took a recess. I stood in the hallway with my chest tight, heart pounding in my throat. James clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You did good," he said. 15 minutes later, we were called back in. The judge looked directly at Dan and Vanessa. "There is overwhelming evidence," he said, "that Thomas Miller was fully competent at the time of the will's execution, and that his decision was made out of love and respect for his daughter. The court recognizes the April 2022 will as valid and legally binding." I exhaled for the first time in hours. The defendant's claims of coercion are unsubstantiated. Furthermore, the court notes troubling indications of attempted fraudulent action, though I will leave that to the discretion of criminal review. He banged the gavel. It was done. Dan looked like a balloon that had finally deflated. Vanessa stood up, stiff and silent, eyes flashing not with regret but rage. She didn't say a word as she walked past me. Dan paused, his lips parted like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. And I didn't stop him. I didn't throw a victory party. There were no cheers, no balloons, no triumphant Instagram posts. When I got home that evening, I kicked off my shoes, sat on the porch steps, and just breathed. The magnolia tree rustled in the wind behind me, its blossoms fully opened now, white and full and unapologetically alive. I remembered how Dad used to call it stubborn. Always the last to bloom, he'd say, but when she does, she doesn't hold back. That night, I walked through every room of the house. Slowly, silently. I touched the chipped doorframe in the kitchen where Dad had etched our heights in pencil every year. I ran my hand across the worn leather of his recliner. I stood in the hallway, staring at the spot where his wheelchair used to sit, still half expecting to hear its soft squeak across the floor. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't end with closure. It lingers in the dust on the bookshelf, in the way the floor creaks, in the scent of Old Spice that clings to the flannel jacket he left behind. I didn't win back a house. I reclaimed a relationship. I restored his wishes. I honoured his words. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Just my name, written in careful cursive I hadn't seen since childhood. Inside was a photograph, one I'd never seen before. I must have been 5. Sitting in Dad's lap on the front steps, holding a popsicle, both of us laughing at something just outside the frame. Clipped to the photo was a small note in Mum's handwriting. "For what it's worth, he always smiled like that around you." That was it. No apology, no call, just that one line. And honestly, it was enough. I didn't need to rebuild everything with her. Some bridges stay burned for a reason. But that photo, that small olive branch, was a start. A recognition. A whisper from the past that maybe, somewhere deep down, she knew I was right. Maybe she just couldn't say it out loud. Dan and Vanessa moved to Charlotte a month later. I heard through an old neighbour that their baby was born early but healthy. I didn't reach out, neither did they. Sometimes family isn't about forgiveness, it's about distance, about learning which bonds can be repaired and which ones were never real to begin with. The garden took time. I pulled weeds, replanted tomatoes, watered the wildflowers Dad loved. Each day, the house felt more like mine. Not because I'd claimed it through courts or papers, but because I was filling it again with purpose. I painted the porch swing, fixed the leaky faucet, hung wind chimes from the eaves that sang low and soft when the breeze rolled in from the mountains. One evening, I found his old cassette recorder buried in the hall closet, still worked. I pressed play, expecting static. Instead, I heard his voice, wobbly but clear. "Note to self," he was saying. "Don't let Rachel make the coffee. God bless her, she tries, but my tongue still hasn't forgiven her." I laughed, out loud, alone in the hallway, holding a 20-year-old tape recorder and laughing like a kid again. Then his voice changed. "But truth is, I'd drink her terrible coffee every morning if it meant hearing her in the kitchen again." I sat on the floor, tears slipping down my cheeks, not from pain this time, but from gratitude. Because somehow he was still here, in the walls, in the wind, in the voice that reminded me I hadn't just been a caretaker, I'd been a daughter he truly loved. So, no, I didn't get rich. I didn't walk away with a pile of inheritance or a shiny new life, but I got to keep the home that made me who I am. I got to keep my name on the mailbox, my memories in the rooms, my future planted in the soil he once tilled with his bare hands. And every morning now, I make coffee. Still bad, still too strong, but I drink it on the porch, under that stubborn magnolia tree. I listen to the birds, I thank the silence, and I whisper back to the house, to the ghost who built it, to the father who never let me go. "I kept it, Dad. I kept it, just like you asked."